Hey everybody, welcome to another Intro to HTML video. In this video we're going to talk about the basics of typography. Typography is the study of type, or how we use type to communicate ideas in a design. In this video we're going to talk about the idea of top-down design, where you're going to set a relative size for your font at the top level on body, and then everything else to that is going to be set relative to that. Let's first take a little look at a website and see how they use type. We're going to look at A List Apart because I think they do a good job with design. And on this page, we're going to see our headline here. I'm guessing this is probably an H2. We can inspect it and check. Nope, that's your H1. That's our H1 for the page. A practical design. And then we've got a little note right here, and then we've got our H2 right here, and then we've got our paragraphs. If we look at this in comparison to what we've been doing so far, we've got my first multi-column. Looks like this. Everything is scrunched up. We put a little bit of white space in between our paragraphs, but we didn't really take a look at the white space in between lines. Okay, so we've got a little bit more white space in between lines. It's almost an entire letter height high in between one line and another. We've got our subheadings have a different color than our main headings. We even have contrast of font families. Our H1 is a sans serif font. Our H2 is a serif font. Our paragraphs are serif fonts. Our H3s, presumably this is an H3, is a sans serif. So we can see some design trends starting to come up in here. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to start talking about the font sizes, and then we're going to talk a little bit about line height as well. So font size. I'm going to start by setting the overall font size of the body. This is going to give us a baseline by which all fonts are going to behave. Let's say I set it to 100%. Okay? So I'm selecting body, setting it to font size 100%. If I set the paragraph to font size 1M, we'll get into what M's are in just a little bit. Then I set my H1 to font size 2M, and H2 to font size 1.5M. You should see that the paragraphs are going to be normal size, H1 is going to be double size, and H2s are going to be half again as big. So I'm going to go to my design that we've been working on, and things kind of change size just a little bit. My H1s are bigger than my H2s, which are bigger than my paragraphs. Now let's see what happens when I go back and adjust the body. So these are all set to M's. This is going to be now set to 200%. What you see is everything on the page changed. This text is fluid, and I'm controlling it based on the top level. What happens here is everything in the design is going to inherit the font size from the body. And we can change the font size on the body, the percentage font size on the body, and it's going to affect everything below it. So if I go back down to 100%, you're going to see it shrink down to the normal size. There you go. If I went down to 75%, you'll see everything get smaller. This can come in really handy when you're doing designs that are going to respond to different viewports. In other words, a web page that's going to change the font sizes when you go to bigger or smaller screens, like a very large widescreen monitor versus a laptop versus a tablet versus a smaller phone. You can very quickly and easily change the size of the body, and it's going to scale things up and down. Now, responsive type design is not quite that simple. Oftentimes we have to be very mindful about what things we're going to change, make bigger and smaller. We might have to tweak the paragraphs and make them bigger than they would normally be in comparison to the H2s. But we're not going to get into responsive design in this class. In short, though, we can start our hierarchy of type by setting a size on our body, and then setting sizes on all of our other elements, and then adjusting the body size bigger and smaller so that everything gets bigger and smaller according to their scale. Now, in the past, we've used pixels for the size of font. You're going to see me moving away from that now. We've been trying to work on making fluid designs. In other words, designs that as the page gets bigger, the design scales nicely. As it gets smaller, the design scales nicely. We've been using relative sizes on just about everything. If we look at the widths and paddings and margins that we've worked on with this, they've all been percents. Percents are a relative value. We talked about that before. They're relative to the size of whatever's containing them. M's are also a relative value. M, well, it goes back to the height of an M in a typeset, the uppercase M, or pardon me, the width of an uppercase M in a typeset, and that's how high the type is. Well, web type behaves a little bit differently, so that's not necessarily how an M is defined anymore. An M is defined as the default height of the browser's font. So if the default height of the browser's font is 16 pixels or 12 point, then 1M is going to be roughly 16 pixels or 12 point. So if that's the case, 2M is going to be double that. It's going to be 32 pixels. And 1.5M is going to be half as much, so 16 plus 8. That's going to be 24. Okay, so then you can kind of figure out how things are going to work if it's 100%. Now, if I kick this up to 200%, that means that this is going to be 32, this is going to be 64, and this is going to be 48. Okay, so that's just kind of how these M's work. All right, so we've got a baseline for all of the font sizes in our document right now. Body is set to font size 100%. Paragraph is set to 1M. H1 is set to 2M. H2 is set to 1.5M. Now let's take a look back at a list apart again. And we talked about contrasting font families. They have a sans serif that's kind of bold for their H1. And then they've got a serif font that's the same as the body copy for their H2. And then their H3 headings are sans serif, and they're red, and they're just a little bit bigger than the body copy. I picked a few fonts from Google Fonts, and I already imported them in here in a style sheet. Roboto, Roboto Condensed, Rubik, Rubik Mono 1. And I've just put right here in a comment just to remind myself what fonts I have available to me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the baseline font family for the whole page. And I think my baseline font family is going to be Roboto. Yeah, I think I'm going to use the Roboto Condensed and see what that looks like. I'll paste it in there, save it, look at it in the browser, and see if I like it. That looks all right, but it looks a little bit small. So maybe if it feels a little bit small because it's a condensed font, I might up the paragraph size just a little bit. Okay? So I'm going to go up to 1.25. So a quarter of 16 pixels is going to be 4, so that means this is overall 20 pixels. You don't have to put those comments in there, but it helps me remember roughly how big things are in comparison to one another. Kick it up a little bit, and that looks a little bit big now. So maybe I'll push back to like 1.15. I'm not even going to do the arithmetic right there, but you could pretty easily figure that out. There we go. That feels a little bit nicer. Although it does feel a little bit condensed, so I'm not a huge fan of that font family. I might just take away the condensed and go with the Roboto. This is, sometimes you have to fudge around with your design until you get the font families that you like and the combinations that you like. And that's what you're seeing me do here live. There we go. That feels a little bit better. They have a little bit more space in between the words. It's a little bit easier to read. And maybe I can even go back down to the 1M. That feels pretty good. 1M and Roboto. Now, I'm going to make my headings have a different font family. You noticed that when I set body to Roboto, everything became Roboto. The H2s, the H1, the paragraphs. So if I want to adjust the H1s and H2s on their own, I might have to do something like this. I'm going to go with, for my H1, Rubik Mono 1. And then for my H2s, just Rubik. Oops. And see how it looks. Save it. Refresh it in the browser. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. The Mono 1 looks really bold and really blocky and hard edge. The Rubik Mono doesn't look quite as blocky, and I kind of like that. So this is kind of a good contrast between them. All right, now let's go back to the list apart article. We said that there was a little bit higher line height in between lines. Line height is defined as how tall a line is. And a line is just the sum total of the text and the space above. So I'm going to go line height, and I'm going to go up a little bit. Right now its default is 100%. I'm going to try 150. See what that looks like. And that spaced it out quite a bit. I'm not sure if I like that a lot. It might be a little bit too much. It's actually pretty close to what a list apart does. I think if the font size were a little bit bigger, that line height might work, but given that the font size is a little smaller, that's a little bit too much line height. So I'm going to go down to maybe 130 and see what it looks like. Save it. Refresh in the browser. That feels a little bit better. We've got just enough space in between all the lines that the paragraphs have room to breathe. But it's not so much space that they become disconnected from one another. All right, so this is a good place to stop here. What we've covered is setting a baseline for the font size with body, and then specifically changing the font sizes for other things like paragraph, H1 and H2, and then using that body font size to scale up the size of everything in the browser, scale it up and scale it down. So that's relative type design. And then we talked a little bit about setting a baseline font family for everything, and then specifically choosing font families for other things, and then a little bit about line height. All right, in the next video, we're going to move on to some other things. We're going to start talking about contrasting font colors. In future videos, we're going to talk about some other things. We're going to throw in a navigation in here and work with rollover navigation effects. In other future videos, we're going to talk about using pull quotes and things like that within our design. And we're going to get this page that we've been working on to be a fully fleshed out, interesting looking design.